While the world remembers Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, for being a one-term president, Africa remembers him for his love of the continent. His enduring commitment to non-racialism and human rights has forever endeared him to the motherland via the significant contribution he made to the liberation of several southern African nations. The 90-year-old former U.S. president has been frail for some time now and recently announced that he will no longer seek hospital treatment for his ailments. Professor John Stremlau joins me via video link as we take a look at the impact of President Jimmy Carter on Africa. Professor, very good afternoon. Appreciate your time this afternoon. Now, what specific actions did Jimmy Carter take to show his commitment to Africa during and post his presidency?
Well, thank you, Hugo. I'm delighted to be able to speak of someone that I have admired for all of my adult life, and he has had a special interest in Africa. His grandson, who succeeded him at the Carter Center, Jason Carter, knows the Zulu and was serving here in the Peace Corps. So Jimmy Carter had contributed a lot to Africa, but it was really for his own redemption. It was coming to terms with racism that he knew intimately in the southern part of the United States. He grew up under apartheid or segregation there, and he managed to transcend that, and then took upon himself when he became president to try to reconcile the contradiction of being for human rights and allied with the apartheid regime here, but also at a time when colonialism still prevailed in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and in Namibia and elsewhere, so Southwest Africa. So he contributed while he was president, and then after that, as the founder and the developer of the Carter Center, he did great neglected diseases in Africa. And when I was there as vice president for peace programs, it was largely election work that we did, and I must have observed a dozen or more elections in Africa during that time, and he had all personal interest in each one of them.
Now, how did Carter's commitment to Africa compare to that of other American presidents before and certainly after him?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I can't speak for all the others. I know Carter quite well, but I don't know George W. Bush, who did PEPFAR, even though he recklessly invaded Iraq. And that PEPFAR was HIV/AIDS, and I know Carter was a big fan of that program here in southern Africa. But his commitment to Africa has gone very deep because of his personal background and moral principles.
Well, I suppose the important question to ask is, what lessons can, if you think, leaders in the rest of the world learn from Carter's approach to foreign policy on the African continent?
That's an interesting question, too, because what Carter did was to treat Africans with respect, even if he disagreed with them profoundly. And he told me once that the first time he met Robert Mugabe, he knew he was a Leninist, and he knew he had very different views from his Carters, but he wanted to be the facilitator for a peaceful transition to majority rule in Zimbabwe. He told me many times that he spent more time working that issue and to some extent Southwest Africa, Namibia issue than he did on the Middle East. And he tried to treat everyone in a negotiation with equal respect. It's ironic that he was failed in his re-election campaign because of the Iran hostage situation, which he took on the Shah at the request of David Rockefeller, for all things. I mean, it's funny how individuals make choices and have to live with those choices. And Jimmy Carter understood that intimately, but he tried to reconcile. It was at the height of the Cold War when he became president, reconcile his commitment to racial justice and inclusion with the old Cold War mentality that led to the alliance between South Africa under apartheid and the U.S. and the other colonial powers. And the other colonial powers were close allies of the United States, too. So it was a tricky moment, and he handled it, I think, very, very well, and to the eternal benefit of Southern Africa, but also as a reminder at a time when we're so frustrated with our leaders here and in the U.S. and elsewhere that you have to have moral character.
Now, I must ask, how did Carter's advocacy for human rights and democracy on the African continent shape the continent's political landscape, if at all?
Well, you'll have to answer that yourself. I mean, we all look at it differently, and at a time, when he was president, he had the CIA commission a study that I've since looked at on South Africa, and they could not envision the kind of negotiated solution that occurred down here in the early 1990s. At the same time, the moral authority of South Africa is frankly at risk now because of the corruption that we have that is amply reported. Thank God we have a free press down in South Africa, as you do in America. And we try to come to terms with these questions. Did Carter's commitment to democracy make a difference in Nigeria now? Well, if the Nigerian people, I mean, one of the things is you have to understand that democracy only grows with the consent of the governed. And if the governed are given an opportunity for consent, they seem to like to exercise that freedom. However, there are strong men everywhere, and we've had bouts of demagoguery here in South Africa, and we're struggling to recover from the state capture phase of that demagoguery. And America is trying to get over the Donald Trump syndrome, which may come back to haunt us. Your leaders really matter, and Carter set an example. But I think really to say that he had an impact is very hard to measure.
Now, I like the fact that you raise the issue of Donald Trump, and he obviously has a love-hate relationship with Africa, if you will. But did President Carter's attitude, if you will, for want of a better description, impact how future presidents might have dealt with the American people, might have perceived the African continent?
Well, when President Carter came to power, it was only barely a decade after the historic human rights legislation that Lyndon Johnson championed. Lyndon Johnson then came a cropper of the extraordinary Vietnam intervention, which was a debilitating one for the country and for America's reputation internationally. But in civil rights, he pioneered a real change, a fundamental change in America. That was still very fragile. I became involved in South Africa because I was concerned that if a race war occurred here, it would infect the fragile racial relations within the United States. I knew very little about South Africa when I first became involved, but I did know that a race war here would be damaging to the U.S. stability that was still very fragile. And Carter knew that was fragile because he grew up in the South. He knew the South well, and he knew how close to the surface this racial discrimination was and still is. I mean, Donald Trump is fundamentally racist in his appeal and nationalist in his appeal, and believes in conspiracy theories, or says he does.
Now, you talk about President Carter's upbringing in the South, and obviously he grew up with African Americans, and that in many ways, I think, impacted his relationship with the African American people, and obviously people on the African continent. Would you care to expand a little on that, and obviously the implication that it's had on the President Carter that we speak of today?
Well, what President Carter said at his 90th birthday party was in very brief terms, very succinct terms. I took it for granted that if the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the American Bar Association, universities, and churches said it was okay for white people to be superior, that was okay with God. He had an odyssey that entailed a deep introspection of his faith and concluded that there is no way in the Bible that would justify racial discrimination, much less in Jesus Christ's teachings. And Bears Nowday had the same stiff sense of fairness as did Mandela. You know, this stubborn sense of fairness, as Mandela said. And there are few people that come to exemplify those kinds of values. But Bears Nowday was one, Jimmy Carter was another, Nelson Mandela was another. I wouldn't put them all in the same boat because Mandela towers over everyone else. But they share that common character trait, which is an inspiration and should be for all of us, African and non-African alike, but particularly given the diversity and the long time history of this continent, it does seem like these leaders are in precious short supply, but really need to be remembered at this time in history.
Well, Professor Stremlau, we've talked about the incredibleness, if you will, of President Jimmy Carter, a great man for all intents and purposes. But where are the flaws in President Jimmy Carter?
Well, as I say in the piece, he was a hard man to work for. He was very demanding, and he has a reputation for being kind of brittle. He's not as flexible or supple, but you know, that was a trait of Martin Luther King as well, another hero of mine. He has to be consistent. And they really do spend time trying to hammer home their consistency, and it is oftentimes on the rest of us hard to reconcile our conflicting impulses, and we do compromise, and we try to go along to get along. And Jimmy Carter didn't do that very often. And when he was president, he was often derided as being not very politically astute, and yet he did pioneer environmental legislation and cured inflation at great political risk. So he did do a number of things which his presidency is now being celebrated for in retrospect. It does take history some time. And if you want to read about Jimmy Carter in Africa, read Nancy Mitchell's 900-page book, Jimmy Carter in Africa, Race and the Cold War. And so she really probes in granular detail his ability to balance the Cold War imperatives with racial justice. And I think the world was a better place for it, and should not forget it.
Yeah, I did pick up excerpts from that book, and it certainly speaks about Carter's behind-the-scenes role in supporting the 1979 Lancaster House Agreement. So incredible work that President Jimmy Carter did. And finally, what are the key learnings that leaders now, particularly in the West, can learn from President Jimmy Carter? Because many of them have overseen peace talks in many African countries that have failed.
That's true. Peace, as he always told me, was hard work. Diplomacy is hard work. And finding common ground is hard work. And you've got to think both for the incentives, but also the obstacles that are in the way to negotiation. It would be nice if South Africa could reassert its leadership, its kind of moral leadership that it did in the early 90s, when their trend toward democracy seemed much more inexorable in Africa. But now, you know, we're going to have the Democracy Summit in Lusaka, Zambia, in the middle of this year, and we'll see how people can celebrate it. But I've just watched the Nigerian election with some interest. That was a country of great interest to President Carter as well. And, you know, they have had democracy since 1999. The military is nowhere near the center of power anymore. And while it's an imperfect election, it is progress. And that's all you can say about democracy. You got to keep moving forward, always forward.
Professor Stremlau, I appreciate your time this afternoon on Newsfeed PM.